Zareen Vatch was known in Braxton Ridge as a quiet herbalist who kept to herself. But when Detective Merral Thorne and Officer Leena stepped into her house on a routine welfare check, they uncovered something so grotesque, so precise, that it shattered every notion they had about evil. Holton Lane stretched along the outskirts of Braxton Ridge like a forgotten path, quiet and still, where time seemed to move slower. It was the kind of road where neighbors nodded politely but never truly knew one another. The street was lined with aging houses, most of them well kept, but one stood out, not because of its grandeur, but because of the eerie silence that surrounded it. Number 47 was covered in thick ivy, its windows shut tightly year-round, and its curtains never moved. The mailbox was rusted, and the porch light hadn't worked in years. Kids whispered about the house when they passed by, calling it the Whispering House, though no one could say why. They just had a feeling about it, like something inside was watching them. For over a year, no one had seen the woman who lived there. Her name was Zareen Vatch, and she was rarely spoken of. She didn't attend neighborhood meetings, never came outside, and didn't even collect her own mail. A few people recalled seeing her years ago, always dressed in gray, always walking, with her eyes cast down. The woman was pale, thin, and forgettable, like someone who barely occupied space. Her reclusiveness wasn't questioned. The residents of Braxton Ridge preferred not to get involved in what wasn't their business. Rumors grew, of course. Some said she was a hoarder. Others believed she was mentally ill. But no one knocked on her door to find out the truth. The silence surrounding house number 47 was only broken by the occasional noise that drifted out at night. Strange thuds, a dragging sound across the floor. Once a neighbor swore they heard a soft whimper coming from inside the house, but when they pressed their ear against the wall, it stopped. No one called the police. In Braxton Ridge, people valued their privacy more than their curiosity. It had been that way for generations. Still, the feeling lingered, an unease that never fully went away. One overcast morning in early April, a mailman named Troy Minley was doing his usual rounds. When he reached number 47, he noticed a foul odor in the air. It wasn't just the smell of mold or old wood, it was sharper, heavier. He wrinkled his nose and hesitated before placing the mail into the box. Something didn't feel right. He looked around the porch, noticing a thick green liquid slowly leaking from the edge of the doorframe. Concerned, he took a step back and called his supervisor. Within hours, a welfare check was requested. 2 local officers were dispatched to the scene expecting to find a natural death, an elderly woman who had passed alone, unnoticed. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house felt like a time capsule. Everything was pristine, almost unnaturally clean. Furniture was arranged in perfect symmetry, as if placed with a ruler. Every wall was lined with antique wallpaper, untouched by age. Not a single picture hung on the walls, no sign of life, no dishes in the sink, no footprints on the floor, no clutter. It was so clean that it made the officers uncomfortable. It was a different kind of wrong. As they moved deeper into the house, they noticed the air became colder, heavier. The smell worsened. One of the officers opened a cabinet and found nothing but rows of labeled glass jars filled with powders, dried flowers, and what looked like pieces of cloth soaked in oil. None of it made sense. They searched room after room, each one decorated like a museum exhibit. Elegant, emotionless, still. When they reached the basement door, they paused. The smell was strongest there. The stairs creaked as they descended into darkness. At the bottom was a room lit by a single flickering bulb, and in the center, seated in wooden chairs, were 5 life-sized figures. Dressed in vintage clothing, their faces painted pale, with wigs neatly combed and hands folded politely on their laps. At first glance, they looked like dolls, but there was something wrong with their proportions. Too real, too still. The officers stepped closer and leaned down. What he saw made him stagger backward and fall. The skin was real. The eyes were glass. But the rest, mummified flesh stretched over preserved bone, was unmistakably human. The silence of Holton Lane had been hiding something far darker than anyone imagined. And the nightmare had only just begun. The discovery in the basement shook the responding officers to their core. The figures seated around the table were not mannequins or elaborate dolls. They were bodies, real human bodies, dressed and displayed, like toys in a sick collection. The scent that hung in the air was no longer a mystery. It wasn't death in the usual sense. There was no rot or immediate decay. Instead, the smell was chemical, sharp and artificial, like the inside of a lab. The preservation was nearly perfect. The skin, though dried and discolored, was intact. The hands were gloved, but beneath the gloves, the shape of the fingers and nails confirmed the truth. These were not dummies. They had once been people. The room was designed like a parlor from a different century. Heavy velvet curtains lined the basement walls, hiding the cold concrete behind them. A soft music box played from a dusty corner shelf. Its winding mechanism was rusted, but the notes still came through, faint and haunting. A tea set sat on a small table in front of the figures, its cups filled with dark liquid that had long since dried and hardened. Each doll was positioned with eerie care, posture upright, feet neatly crossed or tucked beneath flowing dresses. They were posed like they were attending a never-ending tea party. Evidence markers were placed as crime scene photographers captured every inch of the room. The process took hours. No one wanted to be the one to move the bodies. They were so lifelike, so carefully arranged, that disturbing their placement felt like crossing into something sacred or cursed. The officers couldn't shake the feeling that the bodies were watching them, even though their glassy, painted eyes were fixed in a blank stare. The room was silent except for the click of cameras and the occasional murmur over the radio. No one could explain what they were seeing. The medical examiner arrived with a team, and the process of removing the bodies began. The chairs were bolted to the floor, and each body had been strapped in place using concealed wires. The preservation methods used were immediately concerning. Zareen Vatch had clearly spent years learning how to stop time. There were traces of formaldehyde, embalming salts, beeswax, and herbs, an unusual combination that didn't match any standard embalming process. She had created her own formula, mixing chemistry and obsession to keep her family from fading. As each figure was identified, the horror deepened. The first body belonged to a woman named Merral Hart, reported missing 6 years ago in a nearby town. The second was a teenager named Leena Rowe, who had vanished on her way home from a music lesson. Another was a local librarian, Julia Creswick, whose case had gone cold after she failed to return from work one summer evening. These women had no known connections to each other, no common links that investigators could see, except for the fact that they had all disappeared within a 50-mile radius of Braxton Ridge. The fifth body was the oldest. Forensic testing revealed that she had died nearly 18 years earlier. Her identity was initially unknown, but a scar on her ankle matched a medical record of a missing college student named Yvette Doran, who had vanished while hiking in a national park. Her disappearance had never been solved. Now, her final resting place was a chair in Zareen's basement, her face painted and her hands folded neatly in her lap. News of the discovery spread fast. Reporters crowded the street outside number 47. Crime scene tape wrapped around the property like a warning to the world. But Zareen was nowhere to be found. Her car was not in the driveway. Her purse, ID, and phone were gone. Investigators searched the house for clues to her whereabouts. What they found instead was a puzzle more chilling than the bodies themselves. In a drawer beneath the basement staircase, officers found a collection of photo albums. Inside were Polaroid images of the preserved bodies at various stages. Some showed them lying still and fresh, others mid-preparation, their skin partially treated, their eyes unpainted. The final pages revealed something even more disturbing. Images of other individuals, alive, smiling beside Zareen, seemingly unaware of what awaited them. Some of these faces matched missing persons reports from just a few weeks prior. It became horrifyingly clear that Zareen Vatch was not finished. The 5 bodies in the basement were not the full story. They were just the beginning of a larger nightmare that had yet to unfold. As investigators combed through the rest of Zareen Vatch's home, the picture of her mind grew darker and more disturbing. The upstairs bedroom was small and dim, its windows covered with layers of blackout curtains. The walls were bare, except for one corner where a tall wooden bookshelf stood. At first glance, it appeared to hold only antique novels and dusty encyclopedias. But when one detective ran his fingers along the spines, he noticed something odd. A row of identical leather-bound books with no titles. They were worn from frequent use, some with small tears on the covers, others stained with what looked like wax or oil. One book pulled slightly forward, revealing a hidden latch behind it. When pressed, the latch released a soft click, and a panel in the wall slid open, exposing a hidden compartment. Inside this concealed space were dozens of neatly stacked notebooks. Each was labeled with a date and a single strange symbol drawn in red ink. They appeared to be journals, meticulously kept over the span of more than 20 years. These were not the diaries of a lonely woman. These were detailed records of abduction, manipulation, and preservation. The first entry was dated 2007 and described a chance encounter with a girl named Emily, whom Zareen described as perfect in symmetry, delicate in spirit, worthy of eternity. The writing was calm, even poetic. There was no sense of guilt, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, only admiration and obsession. Each journal followed a similar structure. Zareen documented how she observed her targets, often for months, learning their routines, their habits, and their weaknesses. She wrote about the ways she approached them, offering rides, pretending to be a volunteer, posing as a friend. She never used force, only manipulation. Her victims, according to the journals, willingly entered her home, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Once inside, she would drug them with herbal mixtures or sedatives. Some entries spoke of a trial period, where she would evaluate whether the individual was truly worthy of becoming part of her eternal family. The most recent entries sent a chill down the spine of every officer who read them. There were references to new candidates, people Zareen had recently met in the community or at nearby towns. One name was underlined several times: Alice Rannell. She was a local college student who had gone missing 3 weeks earlier. Her photo had been circulated all over the state, but no leads had emerged. Now her name was listed under a heading in Zareen's journal that read, Completion List. Worse still, next to Alice's name were 3 others. 2 of them were women, both reported missing within the last month. The 4th was a man named Ren Hollis, a drifter who had been seen hitchhiking through Braxton Ridge. His name was followed by the words, Too resistant, failed trial. That implied something even more terrifying, that Zareen's collection didn't consist only of those chosen, but also those who failed to meet her standard and likely met a far worse fate. Detectives searched the house again, this time focusing on hidden spaces. Behind the closet in Zareen's bedroom, they discovered another false panel. Inside was a small walk-in room lit with red bulbs and lined with corkboard. Photographs were pinned in precise rows, pictures of people walking alone, smiling in cafes, exiting libraries. Most had red marks across their faces indicating rejection. A few had green circles. All of the circled faces matched names from missing person databases. Zareen hadn't been acting randomly. Her victims weren't chosen by accident. She had developed an entire system, a process of selection and preservation, carefully tracking every move without drawing attention. Her obsession was methodical, scientific even, and far beyond what anyone had imagined. What disturbed investigators the most wasn't just her cruelty. It was how organized and patient she had been. There were no signs of panic or sloppiness. This wasn't someone who lost control. This was someone who had full control and used it with cold precision. Despite the horror they uncovered, one fact loomed above all others. The journals ended. Abruptly, just days before the police entered the house. That meant Zareen had recently been active and likely planned to continue. Her disappearance was not an accident. It was calculated. And somewhere out there, she was watching, waiting, perhaps already choosing her next subject for eternity. The manhunt for Zareen Vatch escalated rapidly. Her name and photo flooded news outlets and digital billboards across the state. A reward was offered for any information leading to her capture. Every agency, from local departments to federal authorities, joined the search. Yet, despite the massive efforts, Zareen seemed to have vanished without a trace. Her car hadn't been found. Her bank accounts showed no activity. No surveillance footage caught her leaving town. It was as if she had dissolved into the shadows. While law enforcement scrambled to find her, a forensic task force continued dissecting the horrors left behind at her home. In the garden shed, tucked behind thorny hedges, they found a locked chest. It had no keyhole, only a combination dial. The puzzle took days to crack, but eventually they opened it. Inside were several small objects wrapped in linen, locks of hair, bits of jewelry, faded photographs. These weren't trophies. They were mementos, collected and stored like sacred artifacts. Each one corresponded with a known victim, labeled with their names in Zareen's neat handwriting. In the same chest was something even more disturbing. A large map of the region with pins marking various towns and highways. A red thread connected each location to a central point, an unmarked patch of forest in a remote area known as Merral Hollow. Investigators had never searched there before. It was considered inaccessible, with no official trails or roads leading into it. Rumors swirled about the place, stories of missing hikers, strange sightings, and a local legend about a woman in gray who wandered the trees at dusk. A search party was organized immediately. Armed with drones, dogs, and heavy equipment, they pushed into the dense woods. It took nearly an entire day before they found anything. Deep within the hollow, hidden beneath a tangle of brush, they stumbled upon a small wooden structure, part cabin, part bunker. It had no windows and only one narrow entrance. The door was bolted from the inside. When they forced it open, what they saw inside made grown men fall silent. The bunker was filled with mannequins, dozens of them, each one posed in lifelike positions, seated, standing, or kneeling, dressed in everyday clothing. Some had wigs. Others wore masks that closely resembled human features. At first, they thought it was just another display of Zareen's madness. But then they noticed something worse. Some of the mannequins were not mannequins at all. Hidden, among the fake figures were real people, victims who had been paralyzed and preserved, still technically alive. A cry rang out from one corner. Alice Rannell was found inside a glass enclosure, weak but breathing. Her body was stiff from the drugs, and her eyes were wide with terror. She couldn't speak, but her gaze said everything. She had seen horrors no one should endure. 2 other women were discovered in similar conditions, alive, sedated, but intact. They were rushed to the hospital where medical professionals worked to reverse the effects of the chemicals Zareen had used to keep them still, nearly frozen in time. The revelation changed everything. Zareen hadn't just killed. She had kept some of her victims in a suspended state, neither dead nor fully conscious, part of her collection in the most twisted way imaginable. She hadn't been building a shrine to the dead. She had been preserving life in a nightmarish imitation of control. Her obsession wasn't with death. It was with ownership. The search of Merral Hollow continued for days, revealing more evidence of Zareen's reign of terror: hidden journals, surgical tools, vials of her homemade serum. But Zareen herself was never found. Dogs picked up a faint trail leading toward the river, but it ended abruptly at the water's edge. Either she had escaped by boat, or she had planned her disappearance with such precision that even nature couldn't reveal her path. The public demanded answers, but the truth was far more unsettling than anyone had imagined. Zareen Vatch hadn't snapped. She hadn't made a mistake. She had designed everything. The house, the victims, the forest bunker. It was all part of a vast, intricate web woven by a woman who had vanished into her own darkness. And now, the world knew what she was capable of, but no one could say where she would strike next. Months passed, and the horror Zareen Vatch left behind continued to ripple across the country. Documentaries aired, podcasts dissected her methods, and investigative specials pored over every detail of the case. People were fascinated and terrified by her precision. Her crimes were unlike anything law enforcement had encountered. No ransom, no chaos, no confessions scrawled on walls. Just silence, strategy, and an obsession so calculated it felt mechanical. Despite constant leads and tips from the public, every potential sighting led nowhere. Zareen remained a phantom. Meanwhile, the survivors who were rescued from the forest bunker began to speak. Not through words at first, but through drawings, gestures, and eye movements. It was clear they had been subjected to psychological manipulation alongside physical restraint. One woman, Merral, had recurring night terrors involving a song that played before she was drugged each day. Another victim remembered Zareen humming and brushing her hair, whispering that she was now perfect and ready to be seen forever. The survivors' testimonies confirmed what many had feared. Zareen had not viewed her victims as people. She saw them as living art, meant to be admired, studied, and preserved. As forensic teams continued analyzing the materials found in Merral Hollow, they came across a small digital drive hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It was password protected and encrypted, but with time, analysts broke through its defenses. Inside were video files, hours of recordings Zareen had made of herself working, watching, planning. In many of the videos, she addressed no one. She simply spoke aloud, explaining her philosophy. She talked about forever beauty, the flaw of human decay, and the need to capture the soul while it's still unaware. She described the pain of losing her mother at a young age, her belief that death had stolen something precious, and how she vowed never to let beauty disappear again. It was her version of a manifesto, quiet, emotionless, and bone-chilling. One file stood out from the rest. It was dated just 3 days before police discovered the tea room in her basement. In it, Zareen stood in front of the camera, wearing a long gray coat and a black scarf. Her expression was calm, her voice steady. She stated that the collection was complete, that it was time to move on to the next phase. She didn't explain what that phase was, but she ended the video by saying, "They'll never understand the mercy I've given, but one day, they will see it." Then she turned off the camera. Despite the unsettling message, investigators remained focused on locating her. Her face was added to international databases. Border crossings were monitored. Even Interpol took interest in the possibility that she had fled overseas. But there was nothing. No fingerprints, no credit card use, no DNA found outside her known locations. It was as if she had planned her escape as carefully as she planned her crimes. Some began to wonder if she was still alive at all. Others believed she had gone into deep hiding, waiting, watching. Then, 6 months after the discovery in Braxton Ridge, a new development broke the silence. A park ranger hundreds of miles away in a rural part of Montana stumbled upon a small, stone structure buried in snow. It was unlike anything he had seen, hexagonal in shape, with strange symbols etched into the stone. Inside, investigators found a single chair placed at the center of the room, surrounded by mirrors. There were no bodies, no tools, no journals. Just one item on the chair, a glass mask shaped like a human face, eerily similar to Zareen's. It wasn't clear if the structure had any direct connection to her, but carved into the stone near the entrance was one line in Latin, Pulchritudo mane in silentio. Translated, it meant, beauty remains in silence. Some believed it was her signature. Others believed it was the final message of a killer, who had outsmarted everyone and walked away. To this day, no one knows where Zareen Vatch went. Some say she's dead. Others believe she's out there, starting over, building a new collection. But the discovery changed how investigators viewed silence. It was no longer a sign of peace. It was a warning, because silence was where she lived, and silence was where she thrived.